India is not, for instance, is abstained in UN resolutions which have condemned Russia's actions in Ukraine. So I think India has clearly leaned in favor of Russia's position, although officially it maintains this neutral stance on the conflict, and it claims to maintain an autonomous or independent relationship with Ukraine and with Russia.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be in Ukraine today to meet the Ukrainian president. It is a significant visit, as Mr. Modi faced criticism from Western leaders and President Zelensky after he met President Putin in Moscow just a few weeks ago. We want to try to understand something of the importance of this trip. We've got Catherine Philp with us, the Times World Affairs editor. Morning, Catherine.
Good morning, Callum.
And also with us, Dr. Chietigj Bajpaee, Senior Research Fellow for South Asia at Chatham House. Dr. Bajpaee, good morning to you as well.
Morning.
Really good to have you both here. Catherine, first of all then, there was quite a vocal response, I think it's fair to say, when Narendra Modi visited Moscow a few weeks ago, meeting President Putin. Today he is in Ukraine. What is this all about? What is this indicative of from a sort of Indian point of view?
Well, first of all, the outrage really arose from two aspects of that visit to Moscow. One, that Prime Minister Modi threw his arms around Putin in a bear hug. It wasn't quite clear how much Putin enjoyed that, because he's notoriously untactile. But it also coincided with a day that Russia sent a huge volley of missiles at Ukraine and killing dozens of people, including children at a children's hospital that was struck in Kyiv that day. So it was a particularly grim day in Ukraine and emphasized the civilian toll of this invasion. I think what's significant about Modi is that he firstly has sought to stay firmly on the fence where Russia and Ukraine are, but has had warmer relationships with Russia. Even since the invasion began, the many Western countries are comfortable with, or given that they're also work with India, and India's been buying a lot of oil from Russia since the invasion and since there were sanctions on those exports, which have meant that Russia has had the economic boost in order to keep prosecuting this war that it might otherwise not have done because there's so many sanctions on it selling oil elsewhere. So this was actually an invitation from President Zelensky, who I think is eager to show that he can speak to everyone in the world, whatever their position is on the conflict, but also that he can give a message to someone who has Putin's ear. And for Modi, I think it's really just another demonstration of this sort of non-aligned or multi-aligned foreign policy that he's keen to pursue, and to show that, of course, that under him, India has become a massive player on the world stage and can undertake a visit like this.
Catherine, stay with us. I do want to bring in Dr. Bajpaee into the conversation as well. Dr. Bajpaee, just as Catherine's speaking there, I'm wondering if there's a thought experiment to be done. What would be the significance if India was to back one or other side very explicitly, rather than to kind of maintain this strategic autonomy, and kind of, fence sitting, to put it frankly? But what if the opposite were true and it did take a side? Would that be a significant thing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think obviously it would be a game changer, but one needs to put this in historical context. I mean, India has a long-standing policy of strategic autonomy in its foreign policy, which means engaging all major poles of influence in the international system. That being said, I mean, India would, of course, claim that it has an independent relationship with Ukraine and with Russia, but clearly in the context of the war in Ukraine, it has leaned more in the direction of Russia's position. We've seen that, for instance, in this peace conference that was held earlier this year in Switzerland, where India did not endorse the communique which came out of that. During India's presidency of the G20 last year, we saw the language of the G20, the declaration, which had no mention of Russia's actions in Ukraine. India is not, for instance, is abstained in UN resolutions which have condemned Russia's actions in Ukraine. So I think India has clearly leaned in favor of Russia's position, although officially it maintains this neutral stance on the conflict, and it claims to maintain an autonomous or independent relationship with Ukraine and with Russia.
Catherine, is there any world in which India could be a peacemaker in this situation, given that it is kind of maintaining something of neutrality?
Well, Modi's talked in those terms in Poland, where he's been over the last couple of days. I mean, it would be an extraordinary role for him to play. He's never shown much sign of peacemaking before. Some of his detractors would say the very opposite. I think it's extremely unlikely, and I don't think for Ukraine he could be considered to be an honest broker for all the reasons we just heard there from Dr. Bajpaee, that India has, when it's come to the crunch, taken Russia's side. And in fact, in that G20 meeting that he mentioned, India made sure that because that meeting was happening on Indian soil, they actually remove references to Russia's aggressive actions from the communique, so that Modi could wrap up a successful summit that actually still produced statements. So those are the kind of compromises Modi seems prepared to make for Russia.
And go on, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to just add my 2 cents
Sure.
there. So I think in theory, India is well positioned to play the role of a mediator. It could potentially serve as a conduit to relay messages between Moscow and Kiev. It could also serve as a back channel between the West and Russia, given India's close relationship with Moscow and Washington, D.C. I mean, one needs to remember that the other countries that maintain good relations with Russia, such as China, Iran, or North Korea, these are all countries with which the U.S. And the West more broadly maintains difficult relations. And also, to some degree, I think it's reminiscent of the role that India has played in the past. Say during the Cold War, it played a prominent role during the Korean War, the French Indochina War. So I think in theory, it could play such a role. But as we've heard, I think so far it's demonstrated limited means and motivation to play such a role. I think its interests or actions are still largely driven by self-interest. Its dependence on discounted Russian crude, its dependence on Russian military hardware, and I think its longstanding historical affinity and relationship with Russia.
Thank you both very much indeed. That's a really, really helpful conversation. Good to speak to you. Dr. Chietigj Bajpaee, Senior Research Fellow for South Asia at Chatham House, and Catherine Philp, the Times World Affairs Editor as well, helping us understand the significance of Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India's visit to Ukraine just a few weeks after visiting Russia. Notable as well that, Modi wants to consolidate relations with the Big Four, as it were, the UK, Italy, Germany and France, but is also self-interested, is trying to boost engagement with other countries in Europe. And is there validity in maintaining something of a fence-sitting approach in a situation like this?